What's the hardest thing you've had to forgive, or never could?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I went 5 straight years without a single birthday call from my parents. No card showed up in the mail, no text came through my phone, not even a half-hearted voicemail that could have been sent in less than a minute. Year after year, I tried to brush it off. I told myself they were busy, that maybe they would remember next time, that forgetting one birthday was not the end of the world. But it was not just one birthday. It was 5, stacked one after another like a reminder that I was not even worth the smallest effort. And then, one random evening, as I scrolled through my feed, I saw a photo that made my chest burn. There was my younger sister Jenna, grinning ear to ear, leaning against a shiny new car with a caption thanking Mom and Dad for the best surprise ever. That was the exact moment I knew I was done playing the role of the overlooked daughter who just swallows it all and stays quiet. The anger that hit me was not just about the car. It was about the years of being the one who handled my own bills, the one who worked overtime shifts to pay off student loans, the one who picked up the slack when Jenna forgot her rent or maxed out her credit cards. I remembered how many times my parents asked me to be understanding because Jenna was finding her way. Meanwhile, I was the one who quietly helped cover the family phone plan so no one's service got shut off. I was the one who drove them to doctor's appointments, who showed up when things broke in their house, who was always on call when they needed something. And yet when it came time to show public love, when it came time to mark milestones, they acted like I did not even exist. Seeing that picture of Jenna with a brand new car was like the universe laughing in my face. I realized then that it was not forgetfulness. It was choice. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list. Not of gifts or favors, but of all the ways I had been the quiet support system while they acted as though I was invisible. I listed the birthdays ignored, the holidays where Jenna's drama took center stage, the weekends I gave up to help them move furniture, paint walls, babysit nieces, and cover emergencies that somehow never ended. And then I made another list, what I could cut off, cleanly, with no explanation owed. The first item was the family phone plan that I had been paying for without recognition. I canceled it before midnight. Everyone's service would now be their own responsibility. Then I opened up my streaming accounts and reset the passwords, knowing full well they had been piggybacking on them for years. I went to the hardware store the next morning and changed my locks because they still had keys from the last time they stayed over just to help out when I was recovering from surgery. I drafted a short message and send it to the family group chat before I removed myself entirely. I am taking space. Please do not show up at my home without asking. No explanations, no pleading, just one clear line. Then I deleted the group from my phone. For the first time in years, I felt a strange kind of calm. It was not happiness, exactly, but the relief of finally refusing to sit in the corner like a backup option. I told myself that I would not engage in screaming matches, I would not waste energy trying to convince them why it hurt, and I would not keep waiting for crumbs. I chose to be precise instead of polite. The silence that followed was almost satisfying. No late-night apologies, no sudden realization from them, nothing. Just the empty quiet of people who had lost access they always assumed was guaranteed. I went to bed that night certain I had done the right thing. 2 days later, my doorbell rang. I walked to the window and froze. It was Mom, standing on my porch with her hands shaking and tears running down her face. She did not knock hard or yell. She just stood there crying, repeating over and over, "It is not what you think." I did not open the door. I stood there behind the curtain, listening, and felt the full weight of years pressing against the glass. Part of me wanted to swing the door open and let her in, but another part of me knew that this was the very first test of whether I could hold the boundary I had drawn. Because if I broke it now, I might as well never have drawn it at all. And that was the moment I realized the next chapter of this story was only beginning. When I finally opened the door, I did it with the chain still on, which tells you everything about where my head was. Because I was not interested in a scene or in a desperate performance on my porch that would end with me apologizing for making anyone uncomfortable. So I let Mom talk through the gap while I leaned against the frame and reminded myself that boundaries only mean something when you hold them under pressure, and she started with the same script I have heard since middle school. about families sticking together, and about how social media never shows the full story, and about how Jenna is at a delicate point in her life, and would I please just be a team player this one time? Because the car is already bought and the insurance bill is heavier than they expected and the first payment is due sooner than they realized, which somehow became my problem in record time. I told her that before we touched the topic of money we would address the 5 birthdays, because I am not handing out emotional bailouts to people who cannot manage a calendar, and she tried to skip it with a soft little laugh that has always worked on me. And I felt the old instinct to make room and smooth things over rise up like a bad habit, so I kept my voice level and asked her to name the last time she wrote my name on a cake, or mailed a card, or even sent a 3-word text, and she stared at me like I had switched to another language, then pivoted into a speech about how love is not measured in gifts, which was rich considering the photo that set everything in motion. When she asked if I could cover the first months of Jenna's insurance, just to stabilize the situation, because you're good with money and you have a steady job, something inside me snapped into a colder clarity than anger. And I told her that what I would cover was my own credit and my own peace, and that started with freezing every bureau so no one could pull my file or slide me into a cosign conversation while I was busy working, after which I would be sending certified letters to the dealership listed under Jenna's post, not because I owe them an explanation, but because I am done being reachable for favors that appear as surprises. And I would also be removing myself as Jenna's emergency contact at her old apartment, because I had already done that sprint to the landlord's office once when the smoke alarm was screeching and she was out of town. And that is a kind of unpaid job I will not hold anymore. She blinked at me the way people do when the usual emotional levers fail to move the machine, then tried the next one, which was a shaky speech about how public perception matters, how the church ladies are talking, how Dad is embarrassed, how I could help lower the temperature by sharing a supportive comment under the car photo to make it look like we are united, and I told her as evenly as I could that I do not manage optics for people who do not manage respect, that I am done with family theater, and that the only public message from me would be silence, because silence is finally cheaper than all the energy I have wasted trying to look good while being treated like an optional extra. I watched her mouth the word ungrateful, which used to land like a punch, and I felt nothing but the relief of finally being the person in my own life who gets to choose where the money, time, and attention go. So I outlined my immediate steps in the same voice I would use with a bank rep, and I saw how much that unnerved her, because this was not a tantrum and not a plea, it was a process, and processes are harder to guilt-trip than people. I told her the family phone plan was closed and would not be reactivated, that my streaming passwords had changed and would never change back, that I had opted out of all third-party data sharing so any dealership or finance office trying to find me would hit a wall, and that I would not host another holiday or carry another chore list that someone else conveniently forgot. She tried one more angle, the one that always made me flinch, the line about how I am stronger and Jenna is fragile and life hits her differently, and I said I am tired of being strong in ways that only make other people comfortable, and that if fragility buys you a car while resilience buys you invisibility, then maybe the problem is not my attitude but their scoreboard. And then, because I wanted something on the record that would stick in her mind, I asked a question I had never asked. How many birthdays did you plan to ignore before you admitted you were doing it on purpose? And the way her face tightened told me she heard the word purpose very clearly. I closed the door with a gentle click and slid the chain off, not to welcome her in, but to assert that I would decide when and how I engage. Then I sat with my laptop at the dining table and did exactly what I said I would do. I placed freezes with the 3 credit bureaus. I created fraud alerts so any attempt to use my information would ping me in real time. I sent a crisp email to the dealership's general address explaining that no one had permission to contact me about financing or co-signing. And I blind copied the attorney friend who once told me that the best way to avoid messy fights is to build fences before the cows wander, which I understand is a ridiculous metaphor, but it has stuck with me because it describes my life too well. After the practical tasks, I wrote 2 letters that felt like oxygen, short certified notes to the old landlord and to Jenna's current property manager stating that I am not an emergency contact and should not be called for access, for lockouts, or for anything else that pretends I still play the on-call role, and then I drafted a single paragraph to my manager at work noting that any call claiming to be a family emergency should be verified through me directly because I have had issues with people using my name and relationship to bypass boundaries, which might sound dramatic until you have lived through the kind of family that treats your reliability like an open bar. The house was quiet in the late afternoon, and for the first time in a long time that quiet did not feel like failure. It felt like recovery, like a foundation being poured, and while I was sitting there feeling the space I had created by saying no, my phone buzzed with a number I had not saved because I did not need the reminder, and when I answered, I heard the voice that has never wasted my time and never tried to sell me a story. Aunt Carol said she had been cleaning out a file box with old documents from Grandma and had found something with my name on it and Jenna's too, and she did not want to get in the middle, but she thought I should see it with my own eyes because it might explain why certain choices were made this year. Or at least expose the reason they were made so confidently, and the calm in her tone made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the truth finally walking toward me with paper in its hands. Aunt Carol's voice on the phone had the precision of someone who had seen too many family dramas unravel, and when she said she had found documents from Grandma that concerned both Jenna and me, I felt a mixture of curiosity and apprehension that left my hands gripping the edge of the dining table. Because I had been building a wall of boundaries over the past few days, and now a possible key to understanding why my parents acted with such blatant favoritism was being offered as a chance to either confirm or demolish the narrative I had been carrying for years, and I knew I had to handle it with both patience and a cold clarity that allowed me to observe rather than react. When I arrived at her house, she had spread a collection of old letters, certificates, and faded notes across the kitchen counter, all labeled and sorted with meticulous care. And she explained that among the papers was a savings certificate set up by Grandma specifically for her granddaughters, with a handwritten note detailing that both girls were to receive an equal portion when they reached 30, a fund intended to assist with either a first car, a down payment for a home, or any significant personal milestone. And that the records indicated that while Jenna's portion had been immediately liquidated in the past winter, my half had been untouched until I had discovered it had been converted, without my knowledge or consent, to cover the cost of the car that now sat gleaming in Jenna's driveway as a public display of my parents' favoritism. As Aunt Carol handed me the documents, I realized that the evidence was undeniable, because it traced every transaction with dates and signatures and included the original handwritten note from Grandma that explicitly stated the fund's purpose and the equality of intent, and I could feel the weight of years of invisibility, of being expected to remain quiet while Jenna's impulsiveness was rewarded, condense into a focused energy that made me certain that I would not allow this to slide without a clean resolution. And I decided in that moment that the next step would be a direct confrontation with my parents, not in anger or accusation, but in calm, methodical presentation of the facts. Because if I wanted them to respect boundaries and understand that I would not be the default fixer or financial buffer anymore, I had to use evidence rather than emotion. When I returned home, I called Mom and Dad separately to arrange a meeting at Aunt Carol's house, making it clear that it was not a casual conversation or a social visit, but a formal sit-down to discuss family matters that had financial, social, and emotional implications, and I felt an odd satisfaction in the precision of it, because for years they had treated me as if my time, energy, and money were inexhaustible, and now the power shifted slightly, not through yelling or emotional manipulation, but simply by demanding their presence and attention on terms I set. When they arrived, I had printed timelines that documented every birthday that went unacknowledged, every holiday I had sacrificed to cover Jenna's mistakes or assist with household obligations, every subtle financial contribution I had made, and juxtaposed it with the records of the car purchase, the liquidation of my portion of Grandma's fund, and the social media post that triggered the whole confrontation, and I watched their faces as the documentation spread across the kitchen table, because the visual of accumulated neglect and deliberate preference is a far more effective communicator than words alone. I began by reading aloud Grandma's note, making sure that every word landed with clarity and that the intended equality of the fund was understood. And as I did so, I noticed that Dad shifted uncomfortably while Mom's lips pressed into a thin line, an expression that conveyed both regret and the discomfort of being caught in a factual presentation that left little room for emotional spin. And then I calmly slid across the table a one-page document outlining a simple repayment plan that would restore my portion of the fund into a restricted account under my name with Aunt Carol as co-signer, along with clear dates and amounts for transfers, which was not framed as a threat but as a condition for any potential reconciliation or continued engagement, because if I wanted emotional justice without chaos, it had to be structured, enforceable, and impossible to misinterpret. Mom's face turned pale, and she attempted a soft argument about how Jenna needed a head start and that I was always secure and independent, but I responded by reminding her that independence is not an excuse for erasure, and that the fund was explicitly for both of us, not to be redirected without consent or transparency. And I observed the subtle tightening of her hands, the faint sigh from Dad, and the shift in energy that confirmed that facts and clear boundaries carry far more weight than emotion when it comes to people who are used to dictating terms without accountability. And I felt a calm surge of vindication that was different from anger, because it was precise and deliberate, not reactive or vengeful. Then Jenna texted me a photo of a notice about her car insurance being past due, with a casual, "Can you just fix this?" embedded in the message, and I did not respond, because the power dynamics had shifted. And I realized that this was exactly the leverage that would allow me to maintain boundaries while demonstrating the practical consequences of my parents' choices, and that the lesson they would take away would not come from my anger or shame, but from a clear demonstration that the pattern of favoritism carries tangible responsibilities, and that I was no longer willing to absorb them, which was a quiet, controlled satisfaction that does not require public drama but lands with undeniable clarity. By the end of the evening, I had drafted formal notices for all involved parties, confirming my removal from any assumed obligations. I had arranged a meeting with Aunt Carol to review the next steps for repayment and oversight, and I had taken a deep breath knowing that for the first time in years, the scales were beginning to balance, and although the emotional tension remained high and the final resolution was not yet in place, I felt the power of strategy and evidence over assumption and favoritism, and I understood that the family dynamic would never be the same again because I had shifted from passive participant to assertive, informed agent in my own life, and that shift carried a weight and satisfaction that no car, no social post, and no forgotten birthday could ever replicate. The tension in the room when my parents arrived at Aunt Carol's house was almost palpable, not because I raised my voice or threatened consequences, but because the evidence lay across the table in a way that could not be ignored. And the quiet power of documentation settled like a heavy weight that no amount of charm or excuses could lift, and from the moment they walked in, I felt the shift in authority, not mine in the sense of aggression, but mine as the person who had finally claimed control over the narrative, the finances, and the rules of engagement that had long been ignored in favor of convenience and favoritism. And as they took their seats, I made sure the documents were visible, the spreadsheets printed, the scanned copies of Grandma's note carefully labeled with dates and names, because clarity is the best defense against denial, and denial is the first weapon of a family that has treated one child as invisible. I began by laying out the timeline, starting with the birthdays, moving through every holiday where I had sacrificed my time and energy, documenting every payment made quietly for Jenna's benefit, every call to the landlord, every emergency run that I had executed without acknowledgement, and then I moved into the financial piece, showing the liquidation of my portion of Grandma's fund and how it was redirected into a car for Jenna without consent. And I watched Mom's face change gradually from the familiar expression of defensiveness to something more unsettled, while Dad remained still, occasionally glancing at the documents as if they were moving pieces on a chessboard, because they could not argue against facts that were clearly laid out. And I could feel the room adjust to my calm authority, not through loudness, but through precision and preparation. Mom attempted to frame the situation emotionally, talking about Jenna needing support and me being independent and capable, and I allowed her to speak while maintaining a level tone, because I understood that letting her vent did not weaken me. It gave me the opportunity to respond with facts and strategy, and when she finished, I calmly asked her to read Grandma's note aloud, ensuring that every word about equality and intention was articulated so there could be no claim of misunderstanding. And I slid the repayment plan across the table, a simple, one-page agreement that restored my portion of the fund into a restricted account under my control with Aunt Carol as co-signer, outlining exact dates and amounts. Because structure is a form of power and clear expectations leave no room for manipulation. I observed the subtle shifts in body language as I spoke, Mom's lips pressing together, Dad's hand tightening briefly on the edge of the table. And I realized that the power of this move was not in confrontation, but in creating a scenario where compliance or refusal carried real consequences that they could not ignore. And I understood that this was the turning point where I transitioned from being the invisible daughter to the agent of my own life, controlling the boundaries, the finances, and the emotional engagement in a way that was both fair and irreversible. And this shift was amplified when Jenna sent a text about the car insurance notice, which I ignored deliberately, because responding would have undermined the lesson and the clarity I was establishing about responsibility. After the documents were reviewed and the repayment plan discussed, I presented the additional layer of social accountability, not through public shaming, but by quietly informing a few key community members who mattered to Mom and Dad. People who understood the dynamics and whose opinions had weight in their social circles, that a factual review of the family situation had taken place, ensuring that the narrative could not be manipulated or spun without scrutiny. Because the most effective leverage in this kind of family dynamic is transparency, controlled and factual, and because I wanted to prevent any further attempts to gaslight or minimize my experiences, which had been a recurring tactic for years. And I knew that by creating this network of awareness, the pressure would reinforce the boundaries and the repayment plan without me needing to escalate emotionally. By the end of the meeting, I had secured the initial agreement in principle, clarified the consequences of noncompliance, and established both legal and social mechanisms that ensured the repayment would occur as documented, while simultaneously reclaiming my personal space and autonomy. And I realized that the most satisfying aspect of this strategy was that it did not rely on vindictiveness or emotional manipulation, but on clear, enforceable action that demonstrated both accountability and intelligence. And as I watched my parents leave Aunt Carol's house that evening, I felt the culmination of years of restraint, frustration, and careful observation crystallize into a quiet victory that was both deliberate and sustainable, because this time, I had not only identified the problem, I had designed a solution that could not be ignored, resisted, or reframed, and in that precise moment, I understood that true emotional justice does not come from confrontation alone, but from control, preparation, and unwavering adherence to the boundaries you set, and that the final moves, though still unfolding, would belong entirely to me. As I returned home, I felt a sense of clarity and calm that had been absent for decades, because the narrative of invisibility, of being the overlooked, unpaid, and unacknowledged daughter, had been interrupted and redirected into one of deliberate authority. And while the resolution of repayment and final accountability was still pending, I understood that the real victory had already been achieved through the precise orchestration of facts, boundaries, and unshakable composure, and I knew that the next steps would simply reinforce what had been established today, solidifying my position not as a victim of favoritism, but as a woman who could assert control over the circumstances that had long dictated her life. The final confrontation arrived with a quiet intensity that was nothing like the dramatic showdowns I had imagined as a teenager, because the room itself, Aunt Carol's kitchen where facts and family history had been laid bare over the past days, now held the culmination of years of overlooked birthdays, unpaid favors, and silent sacrifices that had accumulated into a pressure only evidence, preparation, and calm authority could release. And as Mom and Dad took their seats, the printed documents and repayment plans spread between us like a chessboard, I understood that the power in the room had shifted irrevocably, not through anger or theatrics, but through the undeniable clarity of records, timelines, and Grandma's note explicitly stating the intent of the Equal Fund, which had been misappropriated for Jenna's car without my consent or knowledge, and this clarity left no room for denial. No room for the old script of excuses or emotional pleas that had once manipulated my silence. Mom tried, as she always did, to frame the narrative with emotion, speaking of Jenna's fragility, my independence, and how they had simply acted in what they believed was my best interest, but I listened with a steady tone, not because I was indifferent, but because the facts demanded more than emotion, and I allowed her to finish her speech before calmly articulating the terms that would govern our relationship going forward, outlining that the fund, fully restored into a restricted account, under my control with Aunt Carol as cosigner, would remain untouched for specific purposes until repayment was complete, and that any deviation or attempt to manipulate the arrangement would result in immediate escalation through legal channels. A step I presented not as a threat but as a logical consequence of their prior choices, because the power of a consequence is only effective when it is both predictable and enforceable, and I had made sure every clause was crystal clear. As I watched the expressions on their faces, Mom's eyes glistened with tears, Dad's jaw tightened with reluctant recognition. And I realized that the weight of years spent ignoring my presence and taking my compliance for granted had compressed into a single moment where my authority was uncontested, because I had transformed frustration, anger, and disappointment into structured action that carried both moral clarity and practical consequence, and I knew that this was the precise definition of emotional justice, not revenge for its own sake, but a reclamation of agency and recognition that had long been denied. And the shift was unmistakable in the way the room seemed to recalibrate itself around the simple fact that I would no longer absorb irresponsibility without acknowledgement or restitution. Then Mom spoke quietly, a tremor in her voice betraying the control she usually exerted, admitting that they had used the only accessible funds from Grandma to purchase Jenna's car because they believed I did not need it. An admission that simultaneously exposed the calculus of their favoritism and the rationale that had allowed them to rationalize erasure, and I responded with calm precision, noting that need had nothing to do with the terms of the fund, that fairness and transparency were the conditions that mattered, and that my willingness to forgive or engage further would depend entirely on adherence to the structured repayment and recognition of boundaries. A principle that was non-negotiable because it represented years of self-denial and accumulated responsibility that could no longer be taken for granted. And I emphasized that this was not about pettiness, but about restoring balance and ensuring that past mistakes could not continue to dictate my life. I handed them the notarized agreement, explaining that signatures would formalize the repayment schedule, the restriction of funds for my intended purposes, and the oversight by Aunt Carol. And I made it clear that refusal would activate the small claims process outlined by our attorney, and while this may have sounded dramatic, it was in fact the most controlled and deliberate action I could take, transforming years of passive compliance into active authority and ensuring that every subsequent interaction would be framed by clear rules and enforceable expectations, eliminating ambiguity and removing the option for further emotional manipulation. Dad signed first, his hand steady despite the tension, followed by Mom after a long pause during which I maintained eye contact and waited without offering reassurance, because the power of this moment was in their choice to comply and acknowledge the facts rather than in any reaction I could force, and when she finally signed, I felt the culmination of strategy, patience, and meticulous preparation coalesce into a victory that was both moral and practical, not born of anger, but of deliberate, unassailable action that redefined the boundaries of our family dynamic and established my autonomy as both respected and recognized. After the documents were complete and filed, I took a moment to absorb the stillness of the room, understanding that the long arc of neglect, favoritism, and unacknowledged effort had been confronted not through drama, confrontation, or emotional manipulation, but through clarity, preparation, and unwavering adherence to principles that could not be disputed, and I recognized that the real triumph lay not in the repayment alone, but in reclaiming my own agency. setting terms for engagement, and transforming years of passive endurance into active authority that would guide every interaction going forward, ensuring that no one could unilaterally erase or exploit my presence again. By the time I returned home, I felt a profound sense of resolution, not because the process was complete, but because the rules were now defined, the boundaries respected, and the power that had been assumed by others was finally returned to me in a way that was measurable, enforceable, and permanent. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized that this was the first birthday in years that I did not need anyone to remember, because I had claimed my worth, my time, and my peace, and in doing so, I had finally turned the tables, secured my own future, and demonstrated that emotional justice, when executed with patience, clarity, and deliberate action, is infinitely more satisfying than any reactive triumph, leaving me with the certainty that the last move in this family dynamic belonged entirely to me.